Welcome to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. I am your host, Molly Southgate, and today I'm interviewing
David Richman.
Hey there, how are you today?
Good, thank you, Molly. I appreciate you having me on, and I'm excited to talk to you.
I'm so happy to have you on. This is going to be a great time. So can you tell me about your book?
Yes, so the book is Cycle of Lives, and it is a compilation of 15 stories. There's 16 stories because there's a narrative in between the 15 individual stories, but there are 15 stories that are about a wide range and diverse group of people, survivors, loved ones, caregivers, doctors, executives, all who have been touched by or whose lives are centered around cancer. They either had cancer when they were young or lost a parent to cancer or have been an oncologist for 40 years or whatever. And what I wanted to do with the book was to bring their stories together, that talked about the traumas in their lives and how the trauma affected their emotional aspect of their cancer journey. And so, they all have varying perspectives, wildly diverse backgrounds. They all had issues such as drug addiction or suicide of a parent or abandonment or abuse or something that we all have traumas. We can all kind of halfway identify that with that. And then how did that trauma affect their emotional journey with cancer? So those are the 15 stories. The 16th story is my narrative, where I jumped on my bike and went to visit most of the people who I'd only been talking to for a couple of years as I interviewed them for the book. So I biked 4,700 miles, kind of zigzagging up and down the country to meet them for the first time, and also deal with kind of the emotions behind losing my only sibling to cancer. So the book is not really about cancer. It's more about the emotional effects of things like as traumatic as cancer. But that's the book in a nutshell.
And I just think that is so fascinating and such a great idea. Can you tell me a little bit how the bike ride played into it? Like actually getting on the bike to visit the people instead of conducting the interviews all virtually.
Yeah. So I did actually, I talked to people over the phone for a couple of years. So this was kind of before Zoom. So Zoom's only been around really outside of business for a year and a half or 2 years, right? So I was on the phone talking to people who I had found through cold calling cancer centers saying, hey, do you know somebody interesting I should be talking to? Here's my project, or however I got a hold of them. So I talked to these people for a couple of years, got super, super deep into their stories, uncovered a lot of the emotional issues that they either hadn't dealt with or had dealt with, but really hadn't vocalized, or if they had vocalized it, kind of the way it affected their relationships with people and because of people's inability to interact with them on an emotional level because of things or whatever. And then I said, well, I guess if I want to connect people with stories, what better way to connect them than to get on my bike and kind of draw a line? So my book is kind of like my bike ride was kind of like the thread that binds these stories together. So that's what the impetus for the bike ride was. And I thought it would add an interesting element to the storytelling.
I love that so much. I have not personally gotten a chance to pick up the book, but as I was doing research for this interview too, it's such an incredible concept. And I'm someone that has had my life has been touched by a lot of people that have had cancer, and I know that it's affected me. And this book sounds like something that it just sounds so important to have something that kind of talks more about the emotional side for the survivors and for the people that have lost people to cancer.
Yeah, and that's the emotional side of it is what we don't talk about. And when I kind of came up with the idea for the book, Molly, when my sister was going through cancer, and she died right before we were going to do this kind of fundraising relay for life kind of thing where you're on a track for 24 hours and you're talking to people and you're raising money and awareness and whatever. And I realized, Molly, that people are really good about talking about the tasks of cancer. How do I get to and from my appointments? How do I navigate work? How do I navigate insurance? How do I eat healthier? How do I reduce my stress? Like you and I could talk about that kind of stuff all day long, as me as the patient or you as the person going through it or whatever. But when it came to like how do you feel about all of that? Or what's it like to get that diagnosis and put the brakes on hold from an emotional standpoint? What's that like? People just zip. Nothing. They're just not equipped to talk about it because we don't want to say the wrong thing. We don't want to sound like an idiot. We don't want to impose. We don't want to make people feel guilty. You name it, what the reason is. But it's very easy to disappear or to push people away or to just kind of self-isolate or force other people to isolate because we abandon them because dealing with the emotional side of trauma is super, super difficult.
Yeah, definitely. And it's so really good that hard. You have a book that sheds the light on that. I read another book sometime either this year or last year. I don't remember exactly when, but it's called Dancing at the Pity Party. And it kind of reminds me of this a little bit. It's very different in its formatting and everything, but the way that it touches more on the emotional sides and like the fact how it feels to be someone that has lost someone to cancer or has to deal with the diagnosis and that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And look, I'm not saying that everybody is going to be interested in a book on cancer. And that's not what really this book is about. What I think everybody's interested in, well, at least most people I've ever met are interested in, is in forming deeper connections with the people around them that matter. And I think at the end of the road, if we're fortunate enough to look back on our lives, there's probably only two things that come into our brain, really. And that is the joy we feel over the connections that we've made or the regret that we feel over the connections we weren't able to make or that were taking from us. And so if that is at the center of who we are as human beings, this idea of wanting to form more meaningful connections, then understanding what people have gone through, understanding when somebody says, Molly, oh no, thank you for asking, but I'm fine. Maybe it doesn't mean that they're fine. Maybe it does, but maybe it doesn't. And so if it maybe doesn't mean that they're fine and you want to form a deeper connection, you can ask them, hey, are you telling me that you're fine because you don't want to burden me? Are you telling me that you're fine because you think that if you ask for help, I might abandon you? Are you telling me you're fine because you don't want to really open up because you're going to, you don't want to make me feel guilty that my life is going so well? I could keep going. There's a million reasons why you might just answer, I'm fine, right? I don't need anything. Or maybe you want to burden me with your problems. Or there could be a number of different responses. But what I think is important is that we most oftentimes don't know how to interact with people that are going through very difficult situations. It's much easier to not pick up the phone than to pick up the phone. It's much easier to not reach out than to reach out. And maybe if we can be better equipped to understand what to do through learning what people have gone through and understanding, the dynamics of their life story, if we can learn from that, all the better.
Yeah, definitely. And kind of switching up a little bit what we were talking about, can you tell me a little bit how you got into writing and how you got to the place to write a book like this? Because especially like what you were saying, and I'm so sorry about your sister.
Thank you.
But like, especially dealing with that kind of stuff, it has to be hard to try and get to a place where you can actually write about this.
Yeah. So I've kind of always been a writer, but I've never done it for a living. And so I've written a lot of books. I've had several published, some of them around endurance athletics, some of them around financial services, and then a couple of other books, including this one. And so I like writing. I like considering myself a writer. Why I did this one was because I really felt like I was in a position to be able to say, 100% of the proceeds from the book can go towards charity. And, in the world of publishing, between like all the marketing you have to do and all this stuff, there's not a lot of money in books to begin with,
no.
right?
Yeah.
Nobody reads anymore anyway, but yeah, they do, but they don't.
Please read more, people.
I know, right?
To this, please read more.
they do, but you know what I'm saying. And so it's just, it's just a tough racket, but writing books is so wonderful. And when you just sit down with a good book, there's literally nothing better, right? I mean, it's just awesome. So, but with this book, because I was able to say for the financial side of it was not important. 100% of the proceeds are going to support the organizations that were chosen by the book participants. So you take money out of it. What I really wanted to do was to make a difference and to solve a problem that would bring people forward. And for me, that problem that I saw with literally everybody I talked to was that common thought of, I don't know how to deal with other people, or I don't know how to process my own emotions or let people into my world. I also don't know what to say to other people when they're going through trauma. And so I thought, boy, wouldn't it be great if I can make a difference on equipping people like that? And honestly, I'll tell you one quick story, Molly. I got a call from a guy who said, I was an oncologist, gastroenterology oncologist for 20 some odd years. And he left to go do something else in the cancer world, in the advocacy and wellness space. And he said to me, I read your book the first time in horror because I was wondering to myself, was I a good enough doctor? Did I care enough about my patients as people rather than as patients? And I said, I'm sure just because you're asking yourself that question that you were a great doctor. He said, then I read it the second time as somebody who was so moved by these stories that I thought, how can I be a better friend? And I went, man, that is unbelievable.
That's amazing.
So that's right. That's why I wrote the book, is so that people they could feel empowered to think like, how can I form a deeper connection with people in my life that might matter to me?
I love that so much. And as you were saying too, some topics like this, it's so hard to talk about, and it's hard to find like the words to say that, but hopefully this book can help people find words like that.
Yeah.
So how did you find the people to interview? How did you find people that had stories like this that were willing to have them put into a book? Because it sounds very, very personal.
It is. And not everybody I talked to was able to talk as deeply as we needed to talk about to get to the issues that were important. Right. Because what I didn't want to do is I didn't want to tell a bunch of stories that people go, oh, that's an interesting story about cancer. That's not what I wanted. What I wanted was, tell me more, tell me more, tell me more. Okay. It's kind of interesting to me that, like, I have one guy. Okay. One guy in the book, and I found him through calling a cancer center saying, do you have any interesting stories? And they said, oh, you got to talk to Joshua. So when Joshua told me that as he's being, when you go in for surgery, that like 1 million people come in and go, we are working on your left thumb today, right? And that we're going to, slice it open there and it's going to cause this and you're going to be in here for an hour and it's your left thumb, right? And like 100 people come in and tell you that. And you're like, enough already. On his case, he's getting ready to have a ridiculously huge sarcoma removed from his belly. And he might not survive. And he hadn't yet told his girlfriend the seriousness of what he was going through because he was so macho and he didn't want to let her know. He was young. There was more to the story. But when he was in that room, as they were giving him these instructions, you may die, what we're doing, blah, 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 like 20 people, she finally stood up and she goes, dude, this is not me. I cannot handle this. I am out. And she left. Like at that point. Now, to me, that's an interesting story. Okay? But what's more interesting is when he woke up and he said, I had, 100 stitches down my stomach and they told me I wouldn't walk for 3 days. And in the minute I woke up, I started to learn how to walk again because that pain from my scars, my surgery was nothing like the pain I felt from her leaving me in the waiting room, what I thought was there's more to the story. I want to know what it is. I want to know why would something be that painful? Why is being abandoned that painful? And in his case, there was a lot more to the story. And that's where I wanted to learn. So when somebody says, like when Joshua said, if somebody says to you, yeah, it's nice you to offer to take me to chemo, but I don't really need the help. Maybe there's 1,000 things behind that. And if they're a good enough friend or somebody that you care about enough, or there's somebody that you want to form a deep connection with, then maybe you'll dig deeper and find out whether or not they're really, really in need of help, or if they're in need of you just supporting their decision to not need help or whatever. Mm-hmm. And so, long answer, Molly, to your question, but I found people through, calling up cancer centers, asking friends if they knew anybody who had an interesting story. I found a couple of people on accident. But not everybody was willing to talk because I had to get really, really deep to really understand what was behind the emotional side of it.
Yeah. Wow. I'm just like in shock after that story. I can't even imagine someone doing it and just going, I'm done. I can't handle it. Like, wow. Wow.
Yeah. And that abandonment thing happened to a few people in the book. And I think what's important is, I can wrap my brain around, somebody not being able to be around somebody going through something because you're so scared and you're so afraid for them. And you're, like you don't want to show weakness, or you're realizing, man, I wasn't supposed to be in this relationship in the first place. And, there's a million reasons I can wrap my brain around.
Yeah.
But what I'm more interested in is if somebody's abandoned and it affects them a certain way, like why is that? Why is that? In Joshua's case, he was abandoned as a young kid, because his mom, killed herself, and that forced him to always be macho, and that forced him to never rely on anybody and never believe that anybody was going to be there for him. And when this girl walked out on him, it wasn't about her walking out on him. It was about the truth that he was always going to be abandoned. And he had to learn how to get over that. He had to learn how to trust somebody. He had to learn how to allow people to care about him. And I can relate to a lot of those things. Maybe not the first person relate, but I can kind of wrap my brain around it.
Yeah.
But where I think the beauty in it lies in is if I can understand all of that, and I can have Joshua explain how he is in a place where he's capable of allowing people to care about him. That to me is that I can learn from, right? Cause I couldn't imagine letting anybody in after anything that he had been through. But knowing that, it gives me a deeper perspective to be able to relate to somebody whose fear might be that they're going to be abandoned or something. And so it's just that was the purpose of the book. And people have told me that his story is very inspiring, not because it's so moving about the traumas that he's been through, but because it's so inspirational that he got to a point where he could love and be loved.
Yeah.
Right.
Really.
And so that's each one of the stories, has some element to it that is kind of that one more step, like not just, wow, I want to floor you with this interesting story, but what was the transformation that the person took? What was the turning point in their life? How did they eventually cope with these big emotional issues?
Mm-hmm. I actually want to focus in on that. What you were just saying about how there's like this one more step moment. Mm-hmm. Was there one in the book that was like the most shocking to you, or so like interesting, or something like the one that moved you the most?
They're all very moving. I think the one that it would be in context of the entire book. Let me tell you a story about this person. They're actually outside of Chicago, like you. And I originally got to them through a friend. And the friend said, I have this remarkable couple and they have a bunch of kids and they've been married for 25 years and they are the most incredible, remarkable, successful, wonderful people in the world. The wife has been diagnosed with terminal brain cancer and is going to die soon. And I think you should talk to them. And they were not ready to talk to me. She died shortly thereafter. About a year later, I happened to reach out to the surviving spouse, and he said, yeah, I'm in a place where I'm ready to talk to you. Okay. And, without getting too wordy about this long story, and getting to the answer of your question is that I like to ask people when it comes to the book, I like to say, could you imagine hearing that for the first time, could you imagine hearing, hey, I figured out what's wrong with you. You have a grapefruit-sized tumor in your brain. You are being wheeled into surgery right now. You might not survive, most likely will not survive the surgery. And if you do, the prognosis is probably not going to be good. And you're going to lose your husband and your 6 kids. And everything that you've been living for your whole life is going to be pretty much snatched away from you, maybe in the next hours, but certainly in the next couple of years. And you imagine the person smiling and saying, thank God it's cancer. No. And you go, hell no, there's no possible way I could understand that. But that's so moving to imagine that. But the story goes that here was this couple who had built this wonderful life and this great marriage and these kids. They even survived the unbelievable loss of a young child. They had an 18-month-old die, and their marriage survived. They had a couple of more kids even after that, and they're both wildly successful, wonderful people, the center of their universes, and life is wonderful. But the wife starts to change into a different type of person. And she starts getting angry and she starts fighting and she starts not being who she is supposed to be. And it's going to lead to the end of her marriage, and it's going to lead to the shattering of her life. And she finally, in a moment of clarity, says, we've been fighting for years and it's getting worse and worse and worse. And I know I've been telling you that it's you, but it's me. And I need to be locked up in a mental institution because I'm going crazy. And she had given up. She had just literally given up, saying, this is my life and I've turned into this crazy person and you need to commit me to a mental institution and take the world away from me.
Oh my God.
So they commit her to a mental institution. And that's when they do these medical examinations on her upon admission. And this is when they find the tumor. And so all of this turmoil that had caused her to believe that she was going crazy and that she was going to be forced to give up her life because of that was not that. It was something else. And so that's why she said, thank God it's cancer, right? It's not me. That is a moving story. And it makes me realize that, you know what? Just because it is the most crushing, unbelievable, and horrible thing that so many people had to go through, losing her and having her go through this, there is some light, there's some peace, there's some inspiration in the thought that it wasn't the worst thing that could have happened to her, at least not to her. Mm-hmm. There was one thing that was worse, and that was that she thought that she was going crazy and that she was going to be in a mental institution the rest of her life. You know? And so that to me is probably the most, I mean, all the stories are moving, but in context of the book, like, you never really know what people are going through, and you don't have any idea what they might need or what you could do for them until you keep going further and further and further. So if I told you now, could you imagine somebody smiling upon hearing that? You know what? You can. Mm-hmm. You could imagine it, but before you couldn't have imagined it. And so it just gives you that little bit of insight that maybe we don't know what people are going through. Maybe we don't know. And
like you were saying, like, we really don't know. Every story is different. So for her, it was, oh, thank God it's not that I lost my mind. And I know people that die within a couple months of each other, a husband and wife.
Yeah.
And the husband had cancer, and it was almost like a blessing for him to not have to like go through that grief alone.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just, everyone's thing is so different.
It's different. And if we could, like we said earlier, if the hope is to build more meaningful connections, and I think, that's kind of a common theme with humans, is to build, if the hope is that, then when it comes to times in which we would normally stiff arm and distance ourselves because it's so hard to stay close to somebody who's going through something like that, if we can reverse that and get closer to them and form a deeper, more meaningful connection, or be there for them in a way that we might not have been able to, boy, wouldn't that be great? So that was the whole purpose.
That is really so incredible. And just hearing the story about how the book is made is so inspiring. And it's really something that's so necessary. Because, like you said, no one has these conversations. It's hard
to.
Yeah. I just have a couple more questions for you today.
Yeah, sure.
And now this first one, it's like, how did you decide to keep in certain things and what to leave out in these interviews? Because you're hearing someone's life story.
Yep.
That's got to be pretty rough. Like, okay, wait, is it wrong to like edit their life? Like,
yeah, great question, Molly. Because yes, it for some people. So if you told me 15 different times that you were abandoned in your life, okay, that was a theme that kept happening to you. Okay, I might have written it a 16th way because it fit the narrative of it. So I had to take a little bit of creative license. Okay. But just to capture the emotion and be able to say it in a certain way, because how do you capture somebody's life in 20 or 25 or 30 pages? It's just impossible, especially if you're trying to make a point of a lesson learned or understand the transformation or talk about the emotional side of trauma or whatever. So I had to be a good question asker. I had to listen to the answer. I had to take a little bit of license and kind of craft the story. There might be 90% accurate, 10% kind of creative license. And honestly, Molly, some stories didn't make it into the book because we weren't able to go deep enough. We weren't able to uncover something that would be, although it might have been interesting, it wouldn't have provided enough light to help people with these difficult subjects. And I understand that, like I was talking to one woman and who had twins, and at 3, one of the twins got brain cancer and survives.
Oh,
right?
Okay.
He survived. But imagine her talking about that. And she happened to be in a marriage that was crumbling outside of that. Now, could we have learned lessons from how she got through it and how she was going through it? Yes, but she wasn't able to go there with me with a lot of the questions. It was just so difficult and so hard for her that what I didn't want to do was put her through the pain of just telling me what was happening without being able to talk about the emotional side in a way that would empower people to understand it better. So there were a lot of stories that didn't make it into the book. And one of the most stressful things to do, Molly, was to send somebody the story and go, hey, Molly, by the way, I know you told me that, your dad committed suicide when you were young. And I know that, that your boyfriend, abandoned you when you were getting wheeled into potentially life-ending surgery. And you're in a better place now, but hey, I wrote it out in a story and here you go. That was very stressful.
Yeah.
Because if you didn't answer me in like 5 seconds, I thought you hated me and I thought you hated the story. Right?
That would be
right.
Sort of, and trying to capture that person.
Oh, very difficult, very difficult. And I had a couple of people that were like, yeah, the story's good. Thanks for writing it. I had a couple of people who said, that story's good, but that's not me.
Mm-hmm.
Well, maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. And then I had most of the people were happy with the story. A few of them with a couple of edits, but there were just a few people who were who were really moved and taken. They were like, you literally captured this perfectly. And so, I try to get to the point to where if I'm going to put your story, at least that part of your life story, in print forever and ever and ever, it better be one that's accurate, or indicative of what you actually went through.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Well,
hard stuff.
Thank you so much for coming on. This has been really excellent to talk to you. And I'm really so glad that we could have this conversation today.
Thanks. Me too, Molly.
I have one final question, and that is, what do you have coming?
More books, more stories, more connecting people. I've got all of that. I'm hoping to continue to market this book and, like I said, equip people to make changes in the way that they communicate with others, to everybody's benefit, maybe raise a little money for charity. But more books on the way and more hopefully evocative, interesting stories.
Amazing. Well, you're welcome back anytime. This was really great to talk. All right. Well, for Read Between the Lines, my name is Molly Southgate.
And I'm Dave Richman. Thanks for having me on Cycle of Lives.
Thank you for coming on. Let's end this the way all great stories end. Happily ever after. The end.
Nice.
Thank you for listening to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. You can follow the show on Instagram and Facebook at Read Between the Lines Podcast and on Twitter at RBTL Podcast. Make sure to follow the authors who I've been talking to hear all about their upcoming projects, and also because they're cool people. This show is hosted by me, Molly Southgate, and produced and edited by my dad, Rob Southgate. Read Between the Lines is a Southgate Media Group production, and you can find all the great content put on by the network at southgatemediagroup.com. You can read the story of how I and many other podcasters started in the anthology book Pod Life, which you'll find at the link in the show notes. Also in the show notes are links to buy the books featured on this episode. Using those links supports this show and the incredible authors being interviewed. Have a great week and keep reading.